The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. The road to statehood was not easy for Nebraska. Coming off the heels of the Civil War, the national Reconstruction policies impacted local frontier politics. In this episode, we dive deeper into the struggles of Nebraska's statehood through the 1988 Nebraska History magazine article, Nebraska Statehood and Reconstruction by James B. Potts. Following the decisive military defeat of the Confederacy in the spring of 1865, the North faced the unprecedented problem of restoring the broken Union. But for 2 years, the effort to achieve a peace settlement satisfactory to Northern Republicans was thwarted by discord between so-called radical Republicans in Congress and the President, Abraham Lincoln, and then Andrew Johnson, over both the procedure and the terms for reconstructing the former Confederate states. Indeed, congressional opposition to Lincoln's plan for the speedy and lenient readmission of the seceded states in 1863 set off a struggle over who should take the lead in restoring the Union. After Lincoln's assassination, the rift widened during the administration of Andrew Johnson, and the Reconstruction process became a political contest between conservative supporters of presidential restoration and congressional Republicans who favored a more radical reformation involving the conditional return of the Southern states on the basis of fundamental political and social change. The Radical Congress emerged from the contest victorious. It passed over Johnson's veto a series of measures, including the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the Reconstruction Acts of March of 1867, to ensure the civil and voting rights of Southern blacks. Almost concurrently, Congress also enfranchised Black Americans in the North and West, imposing equal suffrage on the fledgling state of Nebraska and the federal territories of 1867, and on the remaining states of the Union by means of the 15th Amendment in 1870. In February 1866, when Congress was preoccupied with the complex issues of Reconstruction, the Territorial Assembly of Nebraska adopted a statehood resolution, including a constitution which, in line with national practice, restricted the voting franchise to white adult males. A partisan measure enacted by a predominantly Republican legislature and subsequently approved by the voters over Democratic Party opposition, the Nebraska Statehood Bill encountered significant resistance in Washington from Democrats and Republicans alike. Congressional critics objected that Nebraska's population was too small and that the state-making procedure had differed too much from the methods of admission prescribed by Congress in the Enabling Act in 1864, which authorized the people of Nebraska to form a state government. Mostly, however, the opposition was political and related to national reconstruction. Quite apart from considerations of population and legal requirements, the admission debate turned largely on pressing national concerns involving the place of blacks in American society and status of seceded states in the scope of congressional reconstruction power. In the end, questions raised and decisions made in the Nebraska case would have important local consequences and ramifications for developing Reconstruction policy as well. Twice prior to the final statehood drive of 1866, the Nebraska Territorial Assembly enacted legislation that authorized special elections to determine whether conventions should be called to frame a state constitution. On both occasions, in 1860 and 1864, the voters of Nebraska, moved by Democratic Party opposition, sectional and local jealousies, and a general concern that the territory could not afford the added cost of state government, declared against statehood. Despite the unfavorable popular reaction to statehood, it was clear by 1866 that the territory's admission would not long be delayed. By mid-decade, Nebraska had begun to experience important economic and population changes which, coupled to the exigencies of national and local politics, laid the basis for statehood in 1867. The first important change had occurred in 1863 when Congress announced that two branches of the Pacific Railroad, one terminating at Omaha and the other at Sioux City, Iowa, would pass through the territory. On December 2nd, 1863, the formal groundbreaking ceremony at Omaha, the Union Pacific entered Nebraska, and by October of 1866, its rails extended beyond Fort Kearny, some 275 miles west of the Missouri. By 1866, the Burlington and Missouri River, the Hannibal and St. Joseph, and other railroads, all attracted by liberal federal land grants, had also begun to project rail extensions into the territory. The economic and physiological effects of railroad construction were immediately apparent. Property values in Nebraska soared, especially in North Platte's region, where the mere rumor that Omaha had been designated a starting point of the Pacific Railroad produced a spectacular increase. Most important, however, to many residents, the Pacific Railroad ensured the region's future development as an agricultural and commercial center. The iron rails of the Union Pacific would link the territory with the Great Eastern Roads and the Gulf of Mexico, local boosters prophesied, and would render Nebraska the gateway of commerce, not only for our own country, but for the civilized world. Railroad expansion combined with the lure of free homesteads and the restoration of peace also spurred population growth. Prior to 1860, Nebraska had enjoyed a steady, though modest increase in population. Thereafter, the pace of settlement quickened, and the number of residents jumped from 28,841 in 1860 to 122,993 at the decade's end. Governor David Butler estimated that between 1864 and 1866, Nebraska's population had increased more than twofold, from 30,000 to 70,000. Quote, "The tide of immigration is pouring in with increased momentum, and our prairies are being taken up with unexampled rapidity by enterprising settlers who change, as if by magic, the solitary wilderness to the appearance of civilization." End quote. Changing circumstances also diminished the scope of political opposition. Anti-statehood sentiment in populous Douglas County, where residents had voted more than 4-1 against the proposed Constitution of 1860, declined markedly after Omaha became the terminus of the Union Pacific Railroad. Moreover, Kansas and Colorado politicians were pressing Congress to reroute the main line of the Pacific Railroad farther south from the Platte River Valley to the Smoky Hill branch of the Republican River. Nebraska business and political leaders, particularly those in north of the Platte, believed that statehood was necessary to defeat this effort. Quote, "Now more than any other period in our history do we need a good, strong representation in Congress to defend and protect our rights while the railroad lines are being established through our territory. More might be gained or lost for our territory by this one act than all the additional tax that would amount to for the next 20 years to come." End quote. That from the editor of the Nebraska Republican. Still, the 1866 statehood movement, just like in 1864, was essentially a political maneuver, gotten up by local Republican leaders to hold possession of the territory. Of the 30 most prominent pro-state leaders, 27 were Republicans, and though they declared the question to be above politics, most were influenced privately, according to one of their own number, by the consideration that their party sustained a political majority and would control the patronage under the new state organization. Moreover, 20 of the 34 most statehood leaders were federally appointed territorial officials, many of whom, like Governor Alvin Saunders, were determined to become senators, representatives, or state officers. The majority of the federal appointees were also supporters of the radicals in Congress, or they were labeled such by the Democratic opposition and had begun to lose favor with the president. Federal officials, faced with the threat of removal, saw statehood as a means of retaining political influence and thus actively labored to destroy the system that was their prime source of sustenance and power. Although they promoted statehood as a popular local measure, Nebraska Republicans also acted with considerable outside encouragement from National Party leaders. The great motivation for statehood in 1864 had been, at least in part, the National Republican Organization's desire to secure additional electoral support for Lincoln's re-election campaign. Similarly, the belief that Nebraska would provide added votes to effect radical Reconstruction prompted National Party support for the territory's statehood ambitions in 1866 and 67. Congressional radicals like Senator Jacob Howard of Michigan supported the addition of Nebraska and Colorado because, as he bluntly informed his colleagues during the admission debate, quote, their senators and their representatives would greatly increase the Republican loyal strength in Congress, end quote. Not only were state leaders moved by other than altruistic motives, but their tactics also indicated that they had small faith in the electorate or in the popularity of statehood itself. Although pro-state sentiment was growing, they knew that many residents, particularly Democrats, still opposed the project. Sobered by such knowledge, statehood leaders moved forward with considerable preparation. During 1865 and 1866, the pro-state press conducted an intensive news campaign expounding many advantages of speedy admission, and statehood advocates canvassed the territory soliciting support for their cause. The state promoters made the particular effort to persuade Democratic Party leaders to go in for state. Quote, Republicans are almost insane on the subject, end quote, wrote George L. Miller. Quote, they are willing to do almost anything to get a Democratic cooperation, end quote. At the same time, pro-state politicians were laying plans for a new construction that completely ignored traditional state-making procedures. The bitter experiences with conventions in 1860 and 1864 caused the state men to map out a plan that would prevent a similar occurrence. Their aim was simply to reconvene the 1866 session of the Territorial Assembly as a constitutional convention. Their method of attack was disingenuous. The pro-state men printed and distributed petitions throughout the territory that requested the legislature to draft a state constitution and thus, quote, avert the expenses incident to the election, assembling and sitting of a convention, end quote. Governor Saunders responded to this arranged mandate in his annual message by suggesting that the lawmakers, for the sake of expediency, might themselves write a constitution and submit it to the people for approval. Meantime, a citizens committee of statehood leaders met secretly and drafted a state constitution, which administration supporters pushed through the assembly with virtually no debate. The statehood forces had the situation so well in hand that the document was never printed for use in either house, and no amendments had been permitted. Not one man in 20, claimed the Democratic press, ever read those documents. From the first, the Constitution was the center of partisan controversy. The Democrats generally denounced the document, quote, the bastard of demagogism, the Omaha World Herald called it, and censured the assembly for its, quote, utter disregard of all precedents in the formation of state governments, end quote. Not only had the legislature acted illegally, charged the Herald, but in the assembly proceedings, the statehood question itself had been buried and, quote, was designed to be so buried out of sight and hearing in the grand scramble for office. Nominations and promises of appointment to place being boasted by the Republican magnates as the means by which the public sentiment was to be bought into voting for Nebraska's statehood measure, end quote. The statehood campaign proceeded despite Democratic press attacks. Having set both the ratification date and the election of state officers for June 2nd, the Republicans met at Plattsmouth on April 12th and nominated David Butler, a Pawnee City merchant, for governor on a platform urging immediate admission into the Union. The Democrats, by contrast, were divided on the issue. The division related mainly to the practicability of electing a state ticket when the voters went to the polls to approve or reject the Constitution. One faction, comprised of J. Sterling Morton and others who sought to delay admission until Nebraska was back into the Democratic column, was in favor of refusing to run a ticket. They sought instead to base the Democratic campaign upon opposition to the Constitution. But for the majority, particularly those Democrats who held, quote, Omaha's future first, end quote, such an all-or-nothing proposition was unthinkable. Rather, the party should nominate a ticket, remain silent on the statehood question, and attempt to capture control of the new state government. Miller urged Morton, quote, we had better nominate. We can carry the legislature in spite of the devil, and I am not sure, but we may elect the representative and the next delegate, end quote. With a majority favoring the state ticket, Democratic Party leaders decided to discountenance faction and go straight ahead. Meeting at Nebraska City on April 19th, the party nominated the anti-state Morton for governor and enacted resolutions that related almost entirely to national Reconstruction issues. Shaped primarily to entice presidential cooperation in, quote, a war on radical officials, end quote, the Democratic platform applauded the public actions of Andrew Johnson, condemned Nebraska Republicans for their failure to support the president in his, quote, legitimate endeavors to restore the American Union, end quote, and completely ignored the issue of statehood. Lively controversy attended the ratification campaign. The Republicans took up the cudgels in favor of admission, and although they claimed to be neutral on the state question, the Democrats, quote, worked as hard to defeat the Constitution as they did to secure votes for their own candidates for governor or judge or members of the legislature, end quote. James Woolworth observed that every influence, every device, and every false argument was pressed into service by both sides. Aside from statehood, the campaign revolved around national party issues and personalities. The Republicans, for their part, waved the Civil War bloody shirt and reminded Nebraskans of alleged Democratic opposition to the Union cause. Morton, a peace Democrat during the war, bore the brunt of Republican assaults. His imputed disloyalty was paraded before the electorate by GOP editors and party orators. Morton, quote, the Golden Circle champion of the North, charged the Nebraska Republican persistently opposed coercion of the rebel states. He discouraged recruiting and opposed war on any footing, and fully espoused the doctrine of Vallandigham, advocating peace on such terms as the rebels should dictate. The Democrats were scarcely less violent in their attacks on Republicans. Democratic spokesmen, taking advantage of the Republican discord in Washington and the anti-black sentiment in the territory, directed their guns on radical Reconstruction and aimed especially at the suffrage issue. The radicals, they claimed, planned to convert Nebraska into, quote, a black colony to which plantation blacks may be imported to vote down white men. Every vote for Butler is a vote in favor of black suffrage in Nebraska. A vote against the Democratic ticket is a vote in favor of black suffrage and for equality, end quote. The advantage, however, was with the administration, and the election, while close, resulted in a virtual Republican sweep. Nebraska voters approved the Constitution by a slim 100-vote majority and elected the entire GOP ticket with the exception of the candidate for Chief Justice. Democrats contested the results, charging irregularities and fraud in the counting of the votes. The Republicans, of course, denied Democratic allegations and pushed instead to complete the apparatus of state. Controlling the first state legislature, which met in Omaha in July of 1866, they elected two Republican senators, John Thayer and Thomas W. Tipton, and called another election for October 9th to choose a delegate to Congress and a territorial legislature, should Nebraska not be admitted to the Union, and a congressman and a state legislature in case statehood should be achieved. Even though they had won the statehood fight at the local level, Republican leaders were discouraged by prospects in Washington, where Nebraska's admission encountered opposition in the summer of 1866. Especially worrisome was the hostility of Andrew Johnson, who was at odds with Republicans in Congress over the question of Reconstruction and was unwilling to admit another state that might be controlled by the radicals. Moreover, the territorial Democrats actively encouraged the president in his opposition to Nebraska statehood. Some weeks after the election, anti-state leaders journeyed to Washington, quote, to prove that state was defeated by a great majority and that a great fraud was perpetrated in canvassing the votes for the purpose of making the legislature radical, end quote. Nevertheless, the admission bill passed Congress in July of 1866 over a scattered opposition of Democrats and a small block of radicals who opposed the white suffrage provision in the Constitution. President Johnson, however, allowed the bill to lapse by pocket veto. Johnson's denial of Nebraska's statehood had important local repercussions. Prior to the veto, Republican officials in Nebraska, despite Democratic charges to the contrary, had generally declined involvement in the national Reconstruction debacle, and with good reason. Republican leaders were chiefly determined to attain statehood, an achievement that required the approval of both the national legislature and executive. Still a territory, Nebraska was also dependent on the president and the Congress for patronage and appropriations. Under these circumstances, Nebraska officials were understandably reluctant to take sides in the Johnson radical dispute. But after the veto, statehood partisans, including Governor Saunders and a majority of the federal officers, irked by Johnson's obstructionism and perhaps sensing that the president's influence was on the decline, turned increasingly to the Republican Congress for support. Anti-state Republicans, led by William P. Kellogg, William Lockwood, and Herman H. Heath, all of whom were candidates for Alvin Saunders' job, adopted the Johnson label as a vehicle to power. The division of the Republicans and the announced intention of President Johnson, quote, to remove all radicals in office and to appoint friends in their places, end quote, heartened Nebraska Democrats, who also expected to use the executive patronage to gain control of the territory. In the summer of 1866, they joined with the Johnsonized Republicans in a concerted drive to eliminate their enemies. Throughout the summer and fall, Johnson men hurled accusations against Saunders and other federal officers, quote, the principal men of the nefarious plottings to steal victory from the supporters of the president, end quote, and petitioned the administration to remove the rampant and raving radicals from office and replace them with honest, capable Union men. The conservatives might yet control the territory. Democrats informed the president, quote, if you will immediately cut off the heads officially of Alvin Saunders, the superintendent of Indian Affairs, and the Indian agents generally, end quote. Certain factors, however, operated against the success of the Johnson movement in Nebraska. The first was that Johnson's strength in the Senate, which had to ratify his appointments, was on the wane. Thus, while a few federal officials lost their job, most, including the governor, escaped unscathed. Moreover, the president's flirtation with Nebraska Democrats, coupled with the threat of dismissal, drove the federal officers farther into the radical camp and strengthened their determination to secure statehood. Meanwhile, the conservative-democratic coalition was itself badly divided. Much of the trouble was simply that the factional rivalry between ambitious leaders vying for political control. For aside from political principles, party leaders were equally concerned with the future division of the federal patronage and political power. Opportunistic Democrats, like Morton, who actively sought the superintendency of Indian Affairs in Omaha, used the movement as a vehicle to control federal appointments in the territory, while Republican members manipulated the organization for their own political advantage. Indeed, the intriguing that underscored the brief history of the Johnson coalition caused one hostile editor to remark that, quote, the whole crowd of outs can be summed up for their desire to be ins, end quote. The conservatives' difficulties came into the open in the summer of 1866 over the selection of territorial delegates in the National Union Party convention, called by supporters of Andrew Johnson for August 14th in Philadelphia. No less than 3 sets of delegates were chosen. On July 19th, prior to the adjournment of the First State Assembly, the Democratic members of the legislature caucused in Omaha and selected Morton and Andrew J. Poppleton as delegates. Shortly thereafter, another faction, engineered by George Francis Train and Judge William Kellogg, met under the guise of the Omaha Johnson Club, and after excluding from participation all who had opposed Lincoln in 1864, selected William F. Lockwood and Train as their emissaries to Philadelphia. A third faction, led by Herman H. Heath, a political adventurer who claimed to represent the authority of the National Union Party organization, met at Plattsmouth on July 31st and selected James R. Porter, Lockwood, and Heath as Nebraska's official Union Party delegation. Party dissension receded enough to enable the various factions to nominate a common ticket for the fall election. On September 11th, the Democrats and Johnson Republicans met at Plattsmouth and nominated the Democrat Morton for delegate and the territorial secretary, Algernon S. Padlock, a Republican, for congressman. The regular Republicans meeting at Omaha countered by selecting John Taft, a lawyer who later served as Secretary of Colorado Territory, and Turner M. Marquette, respectively, for the posts of congressman and delegate. A third candidate, George Francis Train, a North Platte land promoter connected with Union Pacific Railroad, entered the race as an independent candidate for Congress. Train, a close friend of Thomas Durant and other Union Pacific officials, apparently sought to carry the northern counties and win the election with the aid of Omaha and the railroad. His failure to secure significant Omaha Pacific or Omaha backing, coupled with the urgings of local Johnsonites, caused him to eventually withdraw, but not before he had placed greater strains on the conservative alliance. The fall campaign centered primarily on national party issues. The Democrats denounced radical Reconstruction, while the Republicans urged voters to vote for the old flag and against the party of treason. On Election Day, the majority voted, quote, "the way our brave soldiers shot," end quote, and the Republicans elected the delegate and congressman and a majority of the members of the legislature. The Nebraska question came before the Congress again on December 5th of 1866, when Ohio Senator Benjamin Wade introduced a bill for the admission of the territory on the basis of the 1866 Constitution. His proposal encountered opposition for both conservative and radical factions. Democrats and conservative Republicans, motivated by the consideration that the addition of Nebraska would strengthen the radicals, opposed admission on the grounds that the territory still had too small a population and that the constitutional proceedings had differed too much from those methods spelled out in the 1864 Enabling Act. Though a Republican-sponsored measure, Nebraska admission also met with much opposition within the GOP ranks. Charles Sumner, B. Gratz Brown, and others foremost in the crusade for black rights, while they generally shared the party's desire to admit another Republican state, opposed the admission of Nebraska because the Constitution contained the word white in its qualifications for voting. Humanitarian idealism certainly accounted for the hostility of Sumner, who pronounced the admission bill, quote, "one of the most disastrous measures that has been introduced into Congress," end quote, because it would impair the moral efficiency of Congress and injure its influence. More important to radicals like Sumner, however, the admission of Nebraska with its restrictive constitution would prove, quote, "something like a bar against the adoption of just measures for the rebel states," end quote. Sumner, unlike most moderate Republicans, denied that the southern states ever seceded. Instead, he argued that by their acts of rebellion, they had committed suicide and had thus reverted to the status of territories. As such, they were subject to whatever rules and regulations Congress might impose and could not retain their statehood except on such conditions prescribed by Congress. But since congressional authority to control the franchise in states after admission had never been clearly established by precedent, the right of Congress to impose equal suffrage on Nebraska became, in the words of Sumner, a transcendent importance when we consider its bearing upon our duty to the rebel states. Clearly, if Congress established such authority in the Nebraska case, the way would be open to extend federal control over voting rights as a basis of reconstructing the southern states. Whereas doctrine radicals like Sumner insisted on racial equality and impartial suffrage, moderates and practical radicals like Benjamin Wade, who labeled the Nebraska bill an independent proposition, detached and different from the question of Reconstruction, were prepared to compromise such issues for immediate political gain. Wade and other Republican senators determined to wrest control of Reconstruction from the president were quite willing to accept Nebraska's admission even with suffrage restrictions because, as Wade told the Senate, additional members from Nebraska promised to strengthen the anti-Johnson forces in the Congress. The Nebraska debate also disclosed important divisions among Republicans and among radicals over the finality of the 14th Amendment as the basis for Reconstruction. In 1866, Congress had legislated the amendment, which, among its other provisions, gave the Congress the power to reduce the representation of any state unlawfully restricting the right of suffrage. Many Republicans, moderates and radicals alike, inclined toward the position that southern states would be restored when they ratified the amendment, as had been the case of Tennessee in 1866. Even Wade admitted during the Nebraska debates that he felt obligated to restore rebel states that complied with the 14th Amendment. Doctrine radicals, however, refused to accept the amendment as the final step. Sumner rather insisted that every Southern state, quote, before its representatives were received in Congress, should confer equal suffrage without distinction of color, end quote. The Nebraska admission debate eventually resulted in the interposition of a new principle into the standard admission procedure. On January 9, 1867, the Senate attached the so-called Edmunds Amendment to the statehood bill that provided that the act shall take effect with the fundamental and perpetual condition that within the said state of Nebraska, there shall be no abridgment or denial of the elective franchise or of any other right to any person by reason of race or color, excepting Indians not taxed, end quote. Conservatives objected that Congress had no right to interfere with suffrage requirements set by a sovereign state, but to no avail. On January 9, 1867, the Senate passed the measure as amended. 1 week later, the admission bill, further amended to direct the Nebraska legislature to declare assent, quote, to the said fundamental condition, end quote, carried the House by a vote of 103 to 55. President Johnson opposed the bill on constitutional grounds. In his veto message delivered on January 29th of 1867, Johnson denied Congress the right to regulate the elective franchise of any state. This condition, he declared, is not mentioned in the original enabling act, was not contemplated at the time of its passage, was not sought by the people themselves, has not heretofore been applied to the inhabitants of any state asking admission. It is in direct conflict with the Constitution adopted by the people and is in clear violation of the federal Constitution. Despite presidential objections, however, the Congress, by straight party vote, passed the bill over his veto on February 9, 1867. The fundamental condition attached to the statehood bill drew harsh criticism in the territory. The Omaha Herald wrote, quote, let the state legislature assemble and accept the conditions precedent opposed by Congress if it dare. But remember that before the people of Nebraska, every member must answer for having declared that Congress, and not the people of Nebraska, have supreme power in determining the qualifications of the electors in the state, end quote. Nevertheless, the Nebraska legislature accepted the fundamental condition on February 20th, 1867. 9 days later, on March 1st, President Johnson proclaimed Nebraska as a state. The Nebraska statehood struggle revealed both the character and significance of national Reconstruction policy on the level of local frontier politics. In terms of national Reconstruction politics, Nebraska served as something of a prototype for later reconstructed states. Nebraska's admission marked the first time that Congress imposed, in any essential respect, a condition upon new states that impinged upon its acknowledged power to set suffrage qualifications. And it served notice that, in the future, states seeking admission or readmission to the Union would no longer be allowed to adopt suffrage restrictions based on race. From a view of developing territorial policy, the admission of Nebraska takes on another significance. Nebraska's entry into the Union in 1867 marked, in dramatic fashion, the reassertion of congressional authority over federal dependencies. The concept of popular sovereignty written into the Nebraska Organic Act of 1854, which implied that frontier regions were ready for self-government immediately upon settlement, had represented an important concession towards territorial home rule and had undermined the theory that the Northwest Ordinance that new regions were unfit to self-govern until they passed through specific stages of development. After 1861, however, American territorial policy entered a new phase in which the territories generally were made to serve as, quote, instruments to forward the nationalist policies of the Republican Party, end quote. A major consequence of the shift in federal-territorial relations was enlarged congressional control. This policy shift was clearly reflected in the Nebraska debates of 1866 and 67. In speeches before the Senate on December 20th of 1866, George F. Edmunds of Vermont declared it to be, quote, plain and beyond contradiction that is within the clear constitutional power of Congress to prescribe the terms and qualifications and the time and the fitness upon which any new state shall be created out of any of its territories, end quote. Moreover, he added, quote, it is a right which cannot be questioned at all, and it is a right which, independent of the Constitution, flows logically and necessarily from the supreme legislative dominion which we have over the territories. We, having exclusive and complete jurisdiction over these territories and complete discretionary power, may never dispose of its public lands there, and, when organized it, Congress may keep it in the perpetual condition of a territory if it pleased." End quote. Edmunds' assertion that federal rule was paramount in the territories clearly demonstrated the rejection of the doctrine of popular sovereignty and home rule for the territories, and indicated the Republican intent to return, in principle, to the territorial policy outlined by the framers of the ordinance in 1787. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcast episodes, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.